All right. Hello again. Here we are with a lesson before writing, episode 3. And I've got with me my co hosts here, Brady Harrison, author, among many other things, of The Term Between. This is a book we brought out a couple of years ago. And Brady's got a new book that we'll be getting out one of these days. And then also here with Grant Tracey, whose most recent publication by us is Five Hard Bites, a collection of Hayden Fuller novels and a novella and a short story. And so, again, Grant's already given me a new manuscript to work with. I'll just plug the fact this is my most recent endeavor, Delta of Cassiopeia. I had to look at it. It's like, what's the title of that book? It's a collection of stories and sonnets, and actually a paperback version is going to be coming out very, very soon. And I will plug also 12 Winter Press's most recent publication, The Story I Told My Mother by Jennifer Gravely. It's a collection of poems and then an essay. And I had heard Jen read from this essay, gosh, I think a decade ago, and I started harassing her for a full manuscript, and she finally got around to sending me that over the summer, and so we got this book out just like within the last week or so. Grant, do you know Jen? She was at the North American Review Bicentennial Conference. I know, and you guys published part of that essay, at least, if not the whole thing, on the NAR website. Does that sound familiar to
Yeah,
you?
yeah. What's the last name?
Gravely,
Yeah,
Gravely.
yeah. I remember her, but I don't like know her. You know what I mean? Like, yeah, like the way I know Susan Jackson Rogers because we went to K-State together. But yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So anyway, that book is just out. So in fact, it's so recently out, I don't even have a real copy. This is the proof copy. That's why it's got this weird thing on it here. So when I order copies of Jen's book, I'm going to get a couple copies of Brady's books because I'm out of those as well. But yeah, so we're going to do a few things here. We're going to maybe, hopefully, talk about theme and meaning in fiction. And then we have a featured story that we're going to talk about the last part of the podcast. But this morning when I woke up, I was just being overwhelmed with good news from both of you guys. So I thought I would take a minute to ask you about that. So Brady, besides the fact The Term Between is a finalist for the High Plains Literary Award, is that what it's called? Which I guess the award ceremony is next month. You also got a fabulous review that just came out. So maybe could you tell us a little bit about both those things?
Oh, okay. Well, so I'm absolutely delighted in both cases. Yeah, I'm a finalist for the High Plains Book Award in the short story for the collection, The Term Between. And so for folks who maybe live outside the Western U.S., the High Plains Book Award is a transnational book prize. It collects submissions and considers writers from the Western interior of Canada and the U.S. So I feel very grateful and very thankful for that shout out from the good folks in Billings. And then the second bit of a break. A very nice review that the collection just came out in American Book Review. So pretty thrilled about that. So I guess what I'm actually saying is shouts out to 12 Winters Press for for bringing out the book.
Yep. Absolutely. Yeah. So no, that's all fantastic. So we are, my wife and I are hoping to get to Billings for the ceremony. I don't think that's going to happen after our summer of exotic travel. Our travel budget needs to be, fortified a little bit, but we certainly will be looking forward to whatever you find out there. So that's great. Yeah, I haven't read the whole review because you just said like a half hour before we started recording, so I had a chance.
I just got it myself.
But amazing. Yeah, it's amazing review. I mean, amazingly in depth. I don't know that people kind of who are just sort of getting into the biz, and of course we all work with aspiring writers and so forth. I don't know that they realize how difficult it is to get your work reviewed, especially by really competent reviewers who know what they're talking about. We see so many book reviews, we just say, oh, you write a book, people review it. But it's really, really difficult to get reviews. In fact, a lot of the reviews presses have to pay for, which a lot of people don't realize, like Kirkus Reviews and Publishers Weekly and all those places. They're several $100s a review. So that's why not a lot of independent press authors, get reviewed in those kind of places, because a lot of independent presses just don't have the advertising or the whatever dollars to do that. And then there aren't that many places that are really good at reviewing that don't charge, but that you can get your book in front of. So it's a lot harder to get a review than what I think a lot of people realize. And then Grant, one of your stories you found out last night late while you're watching a werewolf movie, which is a whole nother issue. But you got nominated for Pushcart Prize. I think this may be your 4th or 5th Pushcart nomination. Maybe
but it's super exciting. Yeah, I've never had this happen before. So the condensed version, Reader's Digest. Labor Day weekend, I'm like, okay, I gotta get some stuff out. I send a story to Freedom Fiction, and the editors says I'll get back to you in 5 days. And 3 days later, he gets back to me. They get back to me, and then it's accepted. And like within 24 hours, not even that, it's nominated for a Pushcart Prize. I'm like, is this real? Is this happening? So I go to this site, and I clicked on a couple of links, and sure enough, so under the crime category for Pushcart, Thursday's Money, which is a story I wrote a couple of years ago, and I've been sending it around and getting some near misses with. So it's just really exciting that it's out and it's been recognized, and so I'm super stoked. It's kind of a sequel to the Winsome stories I've been writing with Eddie Sands, the cab driver. So
okay, yeah. That's what I was going to ask you about, if it was a Hayden story or one of your other series that you're kind of working on. So an Eddie Sands story. So very cool. Well, congratulations, both you guys. That's fantastic. And I'll accept the 12
congratulations.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Congratulations to Grant, but I'm sorry to intrude, Ted. But I think there's a very important thing that we need to note. A little bit of good luck, or a lot of good luck, and feeling very grateful. But I will point out that while Grant is watching werewolf movies, I was also in the last couple of days been watching Lon Chaney's werewolf film, and just started last night Boris Karloff's The Mummy. I've been diving back into these great black and white horror films, and so who knows what works in the cosmos. Anyway, let's just take a pack just to watch some more of these movies and see what happens out there.
Well, I will acknowledge for the first time in public my guilty pleasure. Every fall, I just get a yen for Gothic, and so I've been rereading Dracula the last few days, just in bits and pieces. For whatever reason, when the weather starts to turn kind of chilly and the trees start to show a little bit of color, I want to read me some Dracula. So I do.
There you have it. That's great.
So one of the things we talking about is this idea of theme and meaning in fiction. And I'll tell you why I threw it out to you guys as a possibility. Over the summer, I taught a course in advanced creative writing for one of the universities I teach for. And it's a kind of prefab curriculum, which is not my preference, but by and large, it was pretty well done. But one of the modules in this online course was about, basically inserting theme into your work. And I was really kind of taken aback by that, this whole idea of sort of shoehorning, meaning or theme into your work. And when I first started writing fiction many, many, many years ago, I felt that I had to have theme in my short stories, for example. And so I would really be mindful of that as I was writing them. And I had this really bad habit of, like, the final paragraph would be like, for anyone who was reading it who was too dense to figure out what the theme was, I'd have a final paragraph where I kind of hit them over the head with it somehow or another. But then eventually I came to the understanding that theme and meaning are not my business. That as a writer, my business is to tell an interesting story in an interesting way. It's going to mean something, but it's going to mean a whole bunch of different things probably to a whole bunch of different readers. And so I just started leaving theme and meaning alone. And I think my fiction really was improved by that. So I'm just going to stop talking there and see what you all want to say about any of that.
Well, I think theme and thesis, if I may, be so bold here, because are related but two different things. So for example, recently with my students, we read Save the Cat Writes a Novel. And I know it's formulaic and it's based on film and it's based on the 15 beats of a screenplay. But I don't know if it's beat 4, but somewhere in the series there's something called the thesis statement, where I just watched Equalizer 3, and early in Equalizer 3, a character asks Denzel McCall, are you a good or bad man? That's the thesis statement. So then the rest of the journey is to find out what kind of man is McCall. In Grapes of Wrath, early on, Casey, puts forward the thesis of the whole book, where he talks about either the individual or the collective, and we're all part of a big soul. And that's kind of one of the things that, Steinbeck leans into. And I remember reading Russ Tills's book years ago, and he was editor at Esquire for a long time, and he had a recommendation, which I stole for the longest time. I don't do it all the time, but I did it for a while, where he really liked the first sentence to kind of put us in that destabilizing condition. So something like, Jenny couldn't understand why her mom was so angry at her. That might be the opening sentence of a story. So it sets up the situation, the context, the given circumstances, and we move from there. So I do think there's something about thesis, but I do think if we think too much about theme, we're going to lose the story will become overdetermined. And I'll say more about that after I'll give Brady a chance to talk, because I've already talked for a few minutes here. So Brady.
Well, no, Grant, I want to go back to you right away, and so I'll just intrude for a second. But I will say that one of the most important authors or writers or literary figures that has influenced my way of thinking about fiction, but also about theme and thesis, is Russ Hills.
Wow.
Right, and his definition of theme is one I still share with my students. What does the work have to say about how the world is or ought to be? And so I'll chime in on this conversation. But Grant, I want to, if I may, let's go back to you and keep going.
All right. Well, the other day in class, I'm not going to mention the student's name, but it was a really terrific story. So much passion. This student really cares about his characters, but he kind of overdetermined the story. Like, he kept telling us what the theme was, and the theme was be true to yourself. Okay, so that was basically, so it's a kid who's a musician, and he wants to get in with the popular crowd at school, and they want him to play, top 40 stuff, and he doesn't want to play that kind of stuff. So it's all about being true to yourself. But really, the story was about a mother and a son, and at the end, it's got this wonderful moment, and I can only imagine as a parent what it would be like. I saw John Fogerty in Cincinnati quite a few weeks ago, and his son and him were riffing on guitars, trading off solos in Run Through the Jungle. It was fantastic. I can only imagine as a dad what that must have been like for him, to have his kid just shredding away, and then Fogerty, answering. So anyway, it ends with a mother and son on stage together at a talent show, and she's a former, riot girl, early 90s rock and roller, and they get up there and do her songs. She gets up there and joins them in doing the songs. And what I think the story's really about is reconnecting with mom, and it's about the family you come from is more important than the family you're trying to enter into, the extended family of friends at school and all that sort of stuff. And the student didn't see that. The student was so on this track of, and I think maybe I'm to blame because I had them read Save the Cat. So they thought, oh, I got to, I got to get that thesis statement in there in the theme. And it was a little bit hitting us over the head. So we had a really good conversation in class. And I think the students saw that there was something there. And I remember Charles Baxter saying, be careful that the story doesn't overdetermine itself, doesn't announce itself too soon. And you want to find something emerging in the shadows of a story. And I think in this student's story, something was emerging, but he wasn't hearing the melody line because he was so fixed on this other aspect. So I got a feeling once, revisions happen, this is going to be an incredible story by this student. So that's all I got to say about that.
Well, I would, I'll just chime in with a couple of things. I think one of the things that I was taught, or at least heard while I was a student, and it really sunk in when I was working on my master's. I worked with a short story writer and novelist named Beth Lorden, and I remember she talked about the fact that if she had an idea that she wanted to communicate, she'd write an essay. But if she had an emotion she wanted to communicate, she'd write a short story. And that really made good sense to me. And that really helped me to realize that my stories, shouldn't be like also trying to do the work of like an essay at the same time. Now, obviously, we can all think of really great fiction writers who clearly had a message, an agenda. We think about George Orwell, for example, and so on. So I think have been writers of fiction who have a message or a meaning or a theme that they're definitely trying to communicate. But I think by and large, most really great fiction, it comes through the work organically, and it's not necessarily something that the author really focuses on. And just one last thing, as you know, I'm a William Gass devotee, William H. Gass, and Gass always said that his interest was the language and the quality of the language. But he also said that you had to sort of trust the process to have more going on, to let more happen in the text than what you are consciously able to do, and so you just have to depend on the fact that your subconscious, et cetera, is going to, integrate into the text all kinds of really interesting things that you aren't necessarily aware of yourself. And that's very much like what you were talking about with your student, Grant, who didn't even realize this really interesting thing was happening in his story because, he trusted the process and it kind of worked its way in there.
Yeah. And I think only once in my life did I ever write something where the theme was like, okay, this is when the Cheney-Bush war happened. And I went to a lot of protests and, and I was at UNI. I was just getting started, and the poets were having a war protesting where they were reading poems. And so I'm like, well, why can't a fiction writer, we everybody gets to read for 10 minutes. So I'm like, I am going to write a 10-minute story, a story I can read in 10 minutes. That's an anti-war story. It's the only time I ever did that. But I had no idea, like anti-war is a big theme, right? I mean, okay, I'm going to write an anti-war story, but I had no idea what I was going to write. And then I sat down and suddenly I remember playing war games as a kid. And I wrote a piece that ended up, I wrote it in about 20 minutes. I wrote it in a white heat. It was so weird. I went to a library and I sat there and just a 1,300-word story came pouring out of me. And it was like, the muse was working. It's magical. I don't know. And that story ended up getting nominated for a Pushcart Prize. So I want to be, with Green Hills Literary Lantern, I want to be careful, like saying don't do it. But I did it one time. But again, the parameters weren't narrowed down. It was just like, I'm going to do something about the protesting war because I'm a pacifist, and let's see what happens. And so that's, yeah, it was a bigger theme, I guess, than narrowing it down to being real specific. So it allowed for all that organic stuff to happen, Ted, when I was working through the story.
Well, Brady, I'm curious, as a writer and as someone who worked with students on like their final their thesis projects and so forth, what are some of your thoughts on that and some of what you may talk to students about?
Well, yeah, it's been fascinating listening to the conversation. We are always both readers engaged in the process of making meaning and engaging with the work and the works that we love, and what are they about? What do they tell us about, in Rust Hill's words, how the world is or ought to be. But then, as a writer, it's a different part of the mind, or different. For me, it's a different process. They're allied, but for me, I stories come to me in images, and I don't know what the images mean, and I don't know where they're going. And so the language of trusting the process seems to me exactly right. The image has a logic, or it has an energy, not all of which we can be conscious of. And it will, my process is to let the image tell me what the story is. And so I don't know, I don't come pre-armed with a theme or a set of concerns. I have these images that begin to accumulate and coalesce and shape, and so I trust that process and where things are going. So the critical mind and the writerly mind. I mean, this is a subject I have to think about, a great deal more. Leslie Fiedler said he saw no difference between writing about stories and writing stories. Nonetheless, I think the processes are a little bit different. And I don't teach creative writing, so I don't have to caution anybody against going heavily armed with their theme machine out front. But the scholarly, of course, what is this work telling us? What is it offering us? What is it saying? What meanings do we find, or do we find when we read? So they're intertwined.
Yeah.
But I think the impulse of letting the story and letting the characters find their voice and find their action and find the allied images that will build around the images that first come to mind. Yeah, I think that's what I would tell.
Yeah, and I think it's a great point, Brady. And I know on those first drafts, even sometimes second drafts, and sometimes drafts where I blow everything up and start over. It is just mad. It's you put yourself in a position of uncertainty and just trust in the process, and stuff happens. And I loved what you said about imagery and unpacking that and just going with it. You go with the flow, take it where it leads you, follow impulses, all that wonderful stuff that acting's about. I think writing is about. The one thing that I think, though, that where those two allies kind of hit is when you start revising, and now you think you figured out because you're the writer, but even though we understand author intentions, we don't always know the text is always bigger than us. But as a writer, you think, oh, this is what I'm doing, so I want to set that up. I want to nuance it. I play with some motifs earlier on. So I think sometimes in the revision process, that's where we might tinker a little bit with selecting details to foreshadow or announce the theme once it's been discovered, but don't start with it, if that makes sense. That's kind of my thought on that.
Yeah, and I, excuse me, I wonder if this issue then could start to get into cultural differences. And what I mean by that is, one of the things that I'm really interested in as a publisher, and a reader and so forth, is that what we tend to think of as an effective piece of fiction, for example, in the United States, is a pretty narrowly defined kind of thing. And one of the reasons for that is the prevalence of MFA programs and the number of writers who come out of those, and they tend to sort of teach a particular style of writing and so forth. But in other cultures outside the U.S., their sense of narrative and what an effective narrative is quite different in terms of structure, in terms of characterization, and so forth and so on. And I wonder if this is also maybe part of that. And the reason I ask that is because, over the summer I went to, the, International Conference on the Short Story in English in Singapore. And most of the participants in that conference were from like Asia and Australia and so forth, particularly Asia. And I did a paper on, of course, Gass, and talked about his aesthetic theories. And then during the Q&A, a professor, I think was from an Asian country, I assume, asked regarding my teaching in an MFA program, how I taught my students to deal with political and social issues. I think that's the way he phrased it. And I was kind of like a deer caught in headlights, because I don't really teach them to deal with political and social issues. You know, I think most of the time, most American writers at least, are like we've been saying, are mainly focused on telling an interesting story in an interesting way, and not focused on trying to get some sort of political, sociological message across. And in fact, Brady, I wonder if that work you were working on that you've abandoned, maybe permanently, is partly something that was related to this. It sounds like maybe you were working on some sort of social, political angles through this fiction. Maybe not, but that was kind of the assumption that I made.
No, absolutely correct. And yeah, it was the reason I set it aside. It was by my own feeling, it was too aggressively so. It wasn't. It was yelling at the top of one's lungs. But I think, like Orwell can do it, and in Grant's circumstance, as soon as Grant was talking about that story, I was thinking about Neil Young's "Living with War," which is an album I admire a great deal. It's very curious, Ted, and this is just an aside, and I don't know where it's going, but having taught abroad now on a couple of different occasions, what I've noticed that the understanding of what are important American books in France or in Ireland don't necessarily match up very well with what we think. And so there is some kind of cultural pressure exerted on what counts and what kinds of stories are valued. I mean, I don't know what all the implications of that might be, but I mean, I completely agree.
And I think that might be why, I mean, I don't know as much about Ireland as you do, Brady, but I'm a big fan of French culture. I'm a bit of a Francophile, unabashedly so. And they love what they call, noir or roman policier. And I think it's because in crime stories, American writers can kind of deal maybe with some of those social political issues in certain ways that I think we're at the forefront of stuff, like stories about incest, stories about abuse, stories about power dynamics. I can think of so many crime novels, the abuses of power, the abuse of power by police, by people with money. I think about so many of the great crime writers seem to dance around in those areas, and I think that's probably appealing to the French readership. So
fascinating.
Yeah. It's just I've been thinking about this for a while, because it's like I I think writers like David Goodis and Jim Thompson and even Spillane, Chandler, Dorothy B. Hughes, and she has a novel, that just got written up in the New York Review of Books, that's just been republished from a perspective of an African American fella, and it's just, I don't know. I think there's just like the same thing in speculative fiction. There's ways you can kind of play with certain things. Like Rod Serling would get away with stuff because it was not quite of this earth, but he'd be making statements about power. So anyway, just to kind of, I think within genre fiction, there's ways to be political and social justice warriors, I guess, more so than straight literary fiction. Because sometimes I gotta admit, sometimes I feel when I'm teaching literary fiction, it's very, very conservative. It feels like to me sometimes, But I've always been a proponent of the story. It's all about writing an interesting story, and characters don't have to be good; they just have to be interesting. I mean, they don't have to be noble. And I agree with all that, but I sometimes just wonder if my mantra is conservative. So I'm glad you brought that question up, Ted.
Well, I think there's a lot more to say there. I know I have a lot more I want to say about it after listening to you guys. So maybe that could be something we save for our next episode, because I think now we want to turn to our featured story. as our loyal viewers know, both of them, no, hopefully more than that, that one of the things we do is focus on a recently published short story, and talk about what's going on with it and why we like it and that kind of thing. So I get a lot of literary journals, and so this is the most recent issue of Boulevard, which is a really terrific journal. This is the spring 2023 issue, and I mentioned, I think last episode, one of the toughest things about this for me is that there are just so many great stories that are being written all the time. It's hard just to say, well, let's talk about this one, but I have found one for us to talk about. Interestingly, another emerging writer in this issue is a woman, maybe you've heard of her, Joyce Carol Oates, which is one of the writers that Brady was compared to in that wonderful review that just came out, by the way. But anyway, we're going to take a look at a story called Romance Language by Lacy Arnett Mayberry. And it's the winner of the 2021 Boulevard Short Fiction Contest for Emerging Writers. And hopefully you can kind of see a little bit of chops there for Lacy. And, this is it's a little bit longer story than what we normally do. And of course, I really made it a challenge for Grant and Brady by neglecting to send 2 of the pages to them to read. But, I ended up sending them like photocopies, and I scribbled some stuff in mud and sent that to them to read. And so hopefully they've been able to piece together this entire story well enough to talk about it. But I'll just give a brief kind of synopsis here, then kind of jump in because I'm really eager to hear what Brady and Grant have to say. But it is third person with a limited omniscience to the main character, whose name is Gabby Hansen or Gabby Fuchs, depending. And she is a young lady who has an American father and a German mother. And after a divorce when she was a kid, she's grown up in Germany with her mom, never really learning to speak German, which becomes kind of an issue as she gets older. But her father, who lives in Idaho Falls, invites her to come live with him and go to college locally and work as a waitress in this cafe that he owns that's also attached to this pharmacy where he is the pharmacist. And so she does. And so the story is basically about what happens when she goes to visit, or not visit, but to live with her father, who she really doesn't know very well, and work in this cafe. And so most of the story, I would say, takes place kind of in the cafe, and we get to know a lot of the regulars in the cafe and so on. And then, by the way, spoilers always abound when we do this stuff, but eventually Gabby has this revelation about her father, which is not particularly complimentary, to say the least. And so I'm gonna kind of stop there. I think we do want to get into some of those details a little later, but I'm going to stop yammering and see what some of your initial reactions were as you read this story.
Well, I can jump in. I mean, there's so much to admire about this story. It's a short story, and the characters are so vivid. But there's a kind of mastery of the form that I find in this story, that it's put together. I want to resist using this old cliche, but there's a kind of clockwork precision in the way in which this story tells a number of stories that bounce off of one another and then add thereby to each of the other stories. And so it has this way of adding to itself, and yet it's done very quietly. Like at least in my reading, it doesn't shout out that it's how we're supposed to take these different characters and their stories and their backstories, and how they will accrete and increase our understanding of all the stories. But speaking of theme, there's a thematic play, a kind of pattern that emerges, and but it's done so quietly and so economically. It's I think rather a stunning story. I'm looking over at the second computer and reading it. And the last thing I'll say, and I'll get out of the way and let Grant jump in. but I love the title. The matter of languages is played with, and as Ted has already described in a synopsis, that language is an issue. But the matter of romance language, the title's a little confusing at first, but as you read the story and the implications, yeah, it's just so deftly handled in a quiet yet accumulative way. Yeah, it's a wonderful story. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm nattering on.
No, you're not. That was awesome, Brady. I couldn't agree more. The story reminded me of some of the great work of Molly Antipal, and I don't know if this writer's read Molly Antipal, but Molly Antipal's collection on Americans, which deals with the Jewish diaspora, and there's sort of a lot of stories about displaced characters, and this character sort of displaced, living in Germany but doesn't speak the language, has a father in the U.S. And so there's these dynamics of power where she doesn't feel empowered in Germany, comes to the US and right away doesn't feel empowered. There's no TV. Dad promised to pay for education, but sort of wiggles out of that. And there's just like, is she going to find her space there in the US? And as the story evolves, she becomes, I think, empowered. At least that's the way I read the story. And I don't want to give away stuff because of spoilers, but I like Brady's, like, it's all like prismatic or something. It's like way in which all these stories sort of come together, and I just thought it was brilliant in Gabby's journey and the reveal about her father. Like up to that point, before that reveal, the story was reminding me a lot of Antipal's Duck and Cover, where there's this young woman who's trying to get her dad's attention. Her dad works for the Communist Party in America. He's always been watched by police. And a young fella, a Goyish guy, comes into their diner. It's a diner that they hang out in, and an uncle, I think, runs, and invites her to come to his fallout shelter. And so she goes off on this adventure, and she goes to his place, and while she's there, suddenly it all falls apart. The American, she sees how tawdry the whole fallout shelter is. So I was thinking, okay, she goes to this guy's apartment, but then the writer brilliantly just drops that story. Like, it's important, but it's like we have like a blackout, and then it becomes about the dad and this reveal. And I just like, I love that choice. It wasn't about this relationship where everyone's encouraging her to go on this date and all this stuff, and it doesn't become this sort of escapist fantasy where you see reality but don't want to look it in the face. Instead, we just have this weird exchange about meatloaf. I thought it was great, and then we go to this other story, which is the real, and again, I don't want to give stuff away, but anyway, I thought it was fabulous, and so I really liked that turn after the stoner scene.
The reveal about the father, I found it quite unexpected.
Yes,
and then upon some reflection, the whole story was shaped to tell that story. I mean, so well done. Sorry, Ted, I cut you off, but yeah, I just wanted to jump along with what Grant was saying. It's just so expertly done.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I have to admit that I found this story shortly after our last episode, so nearly a month ago. But I sat there one afternoon and read like 2 or 3 or 4 stories, like back to back to back. And the others were really good too, but this one I just decided was really the one I wanted us to talk about. But then a couple of days ago, I was thinking about it, and I realized I was like mixing details from all these other stories together, and so I thought, hell, I better read this story again. And so I ended up reading a second time, and actually a third time. And you're right, Brady. It's one of those stories that the more you go through it, you start to, oh, okay, there's been all these little things that have been seeded into it, so that, yeah, even though it's kind of shocking at the end, when you look back, you realize, well, no, this does start to make sense. Then again, upon a second and a third reading, you see that the writer has really masterfully sown these seeds so that it is believable, even though it's kind of a shocking thing that happens. You don't like throw the story down like, okay, I don't believe it. This could never happen. So really, helps us with credibility there. Let me insert Lacy's contributor's note, kind of parenthetically, then we can get back to the story itself. But this is the writer that we were talking about. Lacy Arnett Mayberry lives and teaches in Midland, Texas. Her stories have appeared in Washington Square Review, the Pinch Journal, and Permafrost Magazine, among other publications. She received an MFA from Lesley University and writes at lacymayberry.substack.com. Okay, and I have checked out her website, so I would encourage everyone to do the same as well. One of the things that's been on my mind a little bit this summer, more maybe than it normally would be, because I wrote this little piece, this little essay thing early in the summer. And one of the things I talked about is writers who take a short story and expand it into a novel. Like, for example, Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway started as a short story, which she had published a year or two before she ended up writing the novel. James Joyce, famously was going to include a story in Dubliners that ended up growing into Ulysses. That was quite a growth spurt, Ray Bradbury ended up taking like 3 different short stories that he had published and melding them into what became Fahrenheit 451. And then as I was thinking about this, I keep referencing the Singapore conference, but it was really a great time. But one of the writers I met there was Robert Olin Butler, who I've admired since the 90s. And I've heard him read a couple of times, but I actually got to know him as like a real human being. By the way, he's everything you would want a famous writer to be. Funny, friendly, kind, witty, all that stuff. But I was talking to him at one point about what he was working on. And he's working on taking one of his short stories that was published back in the 90s and turning it into a full-blown novel. And the reason I bring all that up here is, as I was reading the stories, particularly as I was rereading it, I thought, you've got the stuff here for a really great novel. I mean, you've got all of these really interesting, complex characters. You've got Jewel, who runs the diner, and it is, and again, there's all this really interesting stuff about communication going on in the story. I'm sure we're not going to have time to fully touch on, but like Jewel, on the one hand, is really free about what she talks about in terms of talking about sex and all this stuff, but yet she doesn't have the conversation with Gabby she needed to have so that Gabby understood what the heck was going on for all this time. We've got the stoner that Grant's already mentioned. We've got Nick, the ham radio office or operator, who almost becomes like more of a father to Gabby than her own father, particularly after she finds out what the heck is going on. And so there's just all this really, really interesting stuff going on with these different characters and these different, subtext. We get little snippets of what her life in Germany was like, and every one of them is like, I want to know more. I want to know more about these friends of her mother's that would come to their apartment or whatever, and they were really like kind of looking down on her because she didn't speak German, and the fact she went from being this cute little girl, and one of the things for cuteness was she didn't speak German, but as she got older, that really became, this thing that they looked down on her for because she didn't learn the language or whatever. So anyway, I could very easily see Lacy taking this short story, maybe that's what she's working on right now, who knows, and expanding it into a full-blown novel, because I think it's got all the novel stuff right here. In fact, if she doesn't do it, I might write the novel.
Well, one of the other things that's great and that we want to know more about, and that seems like it has all kinds of implications in the story, is what Gabby reads and the circumstance under which she becomes a kind of reader. And I mean, that the implications of what she reads and how it plays out in the story, it's so great. And as I was listening to both and Grant talk about the story, it was reminding me of what Grant was saying earlier. You might have an idea, but then in revision comes the shaping, and this story just seems like it's so effortlessly done. Yet I don't think maybe effortlessly done, or maybe it took a lot of very careful shaping. But the way that the details accumulate to bring out this texture of the story and all these implications, and all these things we want to know more about, this novel world that's so deftly done. But yeah, what Grant was saying seemed the moment of shaping, or the work of shaping seems to have been done expertly here. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. And it's just, yeah, there's so much depth to it. And I loved what you said about the Jewel character, because she's like one of those characters that she's like a specimen character. We can't wait for her to enter a room. She brings an energy with her. She says stuff that, is always full of lipstick traces of sexuality. And yet, where was she? Where was she? Why did she, like you were saying, why did she not say something earlier? It's people are complicated, and she's like a wonderfully complex character.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I mean, we could spend all day just identifying little jewels, no pun intended, of bits of information, dialogue. One of the things I love in the story is that Gabby is a virgin, and she knows that her mother realizing that she's a virgin would be another one of her disappointments. She would want Gabby to be sexually active, and so it's just such a contradiction to what we normally think of or whatever. But they're just, the story is just full of that, little revelations, a little humorous things, but yet serious too, and it's just wonderful throughout.
And there was a little social justice moment. I can't help but, why is education so expensive in our country? I kept thinking, in Germany it's free, and I was like,
Right.
oh my God, I wish it was like that here, anyway.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, right. What? Go ahead, Brady.
Oh, no. Just because we all read for journals. We all have editorial functions. Can you imagine a story like this landing, in the to be read pile? Ted's enthusiasm, I think, is a measure of how great the story is. So sorry, Ted, I cut you off.
No, that's fine. And actually, I won't even go there. I'll just respond to that. And I think you're right. But at the same time, when you're a reader for a journal, I mean, I try to divvy up stories to you guys in really small doses. And part of the reason for that is, I think if you read stuff kind of in mass, it's easy to overlook even a great story. I mean, reader fatigue comes into play, and everything we read is colored by what we have just read, and so that may make something seem better or not as good or whatever. But my fear would be that this story was rejected, a dozen times before Boulevard finally latched onto it. Maybe, hopefully not, but I know I've had the experience of having stories rejected, but then obviously accepted elsewhere. And one of my favorite versions of that is I had this story Erebus, which I sent to. I don't normally send stuff to editors that I know personally, because if they reject it, then suddenly our friendship is in question. But anyway, I digress. But I sent this story to an editor who had published another story of mine a year or two before, and so she rejected it, and she felt duty bound to tell me why she rejected it, which I frankly didn't need to know. But she and her co-editors, said they liked the story, yada yada, but they thought like the plot device that sort of the whole story hinged upon, obviously, was cliche. I thought, okay, whatever. So I just kept sending it out, didn't without any changes. And then not too long after that, an editor at another journal, Everest, accepted the story. And in the acceptance email, one of the things he noted was that he loved the originality of the plot device. And it's like, so is it cliche or is it highly original? I don't know. And so I could easily see, a lot of really good stories being passed over for, just because of reader bias or reader fatigue or whatever. So I'm curious, Grant, at NAR, I know you guys are just inundated with submissions. I assume as editors, you kind of talk about, how to deal with just the avalanche of material and trying to find just the best stuff. What's your kind of modus operandi there?
Oh, wow. It's I'm hearing a weird echo there. I don't know what's happening. Anyway, I would say that gosh, I often feel that I read too fast, but I have to. There's like 100, there's 500 stories to get through, And like, I guess my feeling is that all it takes is one editor to like your work, right? So I feel guilty about maybe missing some great stories, but I figure someone else will find that great story. And so like the story you told, I've had the same thing happen. Like the story that just got nominated for Pushcart Prize, I've had rejected 7 or 8 times. You know, I submitted it to a contest and I made the short list, but not the final list that got sent to the judge, you know, and I'm like, but I believed in the story and I just kept sending it out. And finally I found an editor that was super excited about it. So I guess my advice would be to writers, if you believe in the story, stick with it, because you'll find an editor that will believe in it also. And so much of this is personal taste. Like, it's one thing if you get the Norton anthology and it's telling you, dear reader, these are the important stories, right, that you must learn, and to be able to talk about it at the water cooler, right? And so everyone's like, oh yeah, chrysanthemums, Steinbeck, right. You know, but
and you love Steinbeck as a thing.
I do. Steinbeck's one of my favorite writers, but I don't particularly like the chrysanthemums. But I'm just saying, I think he's brilliant, and you know, but so if it doesn't have the Norton anthology stamp of approval, all of us are reading stuff without that awareness, and we have to figure it out. We have to deal with our own tastes, and we have to accept our own foibles. And yeah, I'm sure I've passed on something that ended up being nominated for a Pushcart Prize somewhere else or won an O. Henry Award. It's okay. That's how I look at it, I guess. You know.
Well, just to chime in too, what I've learned in this very long process is what I think is good, other people might not share that opinion. And so stories that I liked and I thought, you know, I had done a good job, and they were accepted right away. And stories I thought that were great by my standards, so not great in the world, but just my own, you know, like I was very pleased, like this was precisely the thing I wanted it to be. You know, took a long time to find a good home. So there's no knowing. And I think, yeah, I mean, I'll have to agree with both Ted and Grant. The matter of fatigue is real.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, your eyeballs can only do so much work. And it turns out very likely we all have day jobs.
And you know,
even in retirement, for me.
And I think you hit it on the head too. Like, and I hate this. Like, you take a certain story and it deals with it. Okay, coming back to theme again. Maybe it's got like a queer theme to it or something, and then you get another story that's queer themed in a similar way, like the same kind of given circumstances, and you can't help but compare it to the other story. And if it would have come in at a different time, it would have gone to the top. But it's like, I just read a story like this and it was better. And that's just not fair, but that's how it kind of rolls, you know. But I have had it happen where it's like, I just read a story like this and this one's better, so I'm gonna take this one too, you know. So but yeah, it's a tricky thing. And or if I get in a bad mood or something, I know I got to shut down. Like, it's so I'm not fair to the writers out there. You know, like something's going on in my classes, or I just got a story rejected, I'm pissed off, and then it's like, okay, let's you know, step away. It's not time to read other people's work because you're not in the right frame of mind. But it's tricky being an editor.
Yeah, right. We probably need to kind of wrap this up. Again, just you know, kudos to Lacy Arnett Mayberry for this wonderful story, and kudos to Boulevard for publishing it. There's also a really great craft interview with Danielle Dutton, so I would highly recommend tracking that down as well. So well, let me come back to you just for kind of final thoughts before we sign off here. Brady, do you have any kind of final words of wisdom or some questions or whatever you'd like to leave us with?
Oh, well, just I think that just as a casual observer of our own podcast, it seems the more we engage in conversation, the more things that are coming to mind. Like this multi a sort of Hydra event unfolding. So I can't speak to anybody who might be tuning in to watch us. But I think there's so much more that we're going to want to explore and talk about. And I love reading these stories and then talking about, like, it's so great. Like, just as Grant was just saying, like, these stories, there's so much. This doesn't have the Norton Anthology, seal of approval, but it's so great, right? This is a real pleasure. Just all this great writing going on out there, and we're lucky enough to get to read it. Some of it.
And I remember when we were in Albuquerque, the three of us, and I'm going to sound like an old dinosaur, but I am old and I like dinosaurs. Okay. But
and you're wearing green.
And I'm wearing green, the Green Hornet, baby. But I just got to say, there is something in me that misses the idea of the canon, misses the idea of having shared works that we all as English lit majors were expected to read and then we're able to talk about. And I know that sounds like an old fuddy-duddy, but it's something that's been lost with this sort of postmodern explosion of, like, I work with so many grad students and the reading lists are so diverse and it's great, but there's the common read. It seems to have disappeared from our field in some ways, and I think that's too bad.
We don't have coins in common. Sorry, Ted. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I was just going to say I think I agree with what you said, Grant, and I'm a big advocate of the expansion of the canon, and and I try to bring in international works that don't operate in the way that we tend to think of them in the U.S. and all that. I know you do too, but from a teaching standpoint, it used to be really handy when you could talk to students and you could mention Bartleby the Scrivener and you could mention this, you could mention that. From a teaching standpoint, just to make some points or to make some comparisons, and that's just getting harder and harder and harder because there's just so much wide variety of reading out there.
Yeah, and I got students that, and let's say in a slam, I mean, they're reading so great, but it's mainly YA stuff, and YA is an expanding field and it's exciting, but they don't know some of the great practitioners of the short story. Like, you talk about James Joyce, I'm thinking Hemingway, I'm thinking Steinbeck, Carson McCullers, going way back, like Bernard Malamud, Roth. I mean, some of the writers that are just like, to me, were like, those are the writers I wanted to write like and emulate and learn from. And I'll drop Sherwood Anderson's name and I just get blank faces. And I'm like, okay, moving on, I'm saying? So yeah, it's different. It's how things evolve.
Right. Well, that may be another good topic for another episode, but I'm going to hit the stop recording button just because we've been at it for a while. But really appreciate all of your thoughts. And again, final congratulations on all your successes that you got to report in the last 24 hours. Actually, like the last 2 hours, or something. Anyway, great talking to you guys, and we will see you in about a month, I presume.
Yeah. Thanks, Ted. Congrats, Brady.
Thanks, Ted. Yeah. You too, Grant.
All right. Bye-bye.